The screams came at dawn. Across the slave quarters of Goshen, Hebrew mothers clutched their newborn sons with trembling hands, knowing that today, like yesterday and the day before, Egyptian soldiers would come. They came every morning now. These men with cold eyes and colder hearts, moving from house to house with the methodical efficiency of those who had done this too many times before. The orders were clear, issued from the highest throne in the land. Every Hebrew boy born must die. Not tomorrow, not later, now. Picture a young mother, her name lost to history, but her anguish echoing through millennia. She had labored through the night, bringing her firstborn son into a world that wanted him dead before he drew his first breath. She held him now, this tiny miracle still wet from birth, his eyes barely open, his fingers curling and uncurling as he sought the warmth of her skin. She could hear the soldiers in the neighboring house, the pounding on the door, the shouting. Then the scream that every mother in Goshen had learned to recognize, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality, the cry of a woman whose child was being ripped from her arms. The door to her home splintered open, heavy footsteps crossed the threshold. Hands reached for her baby. She fought because what mother wouldn't fight, even knowing it was futile. Her husband tried to intervene and was struck down. Her older daughters wept in the corner. And then her son was gone, carried away by men who saw him not as a human being but as a threat, as a future rebellion that must be drowned before it could walk. They took him to the Nile, the great river that gave Egypt life, that flooded each year to bring fertility to the land, that was worshipped as a god itself, had become a graveyard for innocence. The crocodiles grew fat. The water ran with the blood of a genocide that history would remember, even if it never recorded the names of the murdered children or their devastated mothers. This was not the beginning of Hebrew suffering in Egypt. This was its darkest crescendo. Before we open today's scroll, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It helps us keep these in-depth stories of faith, history, and mystery alive. And as always, let us know where in the world you're watching from. This channel has become a global fellowship of seekers, historians, believers, and thinkers united by curiosity. Now take a deep breath and step with me into the pages of time. 400 years earlier, a different story had unfolded. A family of 70 souls, led by an old man named Jacob, had come to Egypt not as slaves but as honored guests. Joseph, one of Jacob's 12 sons, had risen from prisoner to prime minister, second only to Pharaoh himself. When famine gripped the ancient world, Egypt alone had food because Joseph had interpreted Pharaoh's dreams and prepared for the coming crisis. Jacob's family settled in Goshen, the most fertile region of the Nile Delta, and they prospered there. They multiplied. They grew strong. But Joseph died. His generation passed away, and eventually a new king arose over Egypt, one who did not know Joseph, who did not remember the debt Egypt owed to this Hebrew family. What this new Pharaoh saw was a population within his borders that spoke a different language, worshipped a different god, kept different customs. He saw them growing numerous, and he was afraid. Fear is the parent of cruelty. First came the enslavement. The Hebrews, who had been free herders and shepherds, were conscripted into forced labor. They built Pharaoh's treasure cities, Pithom and Ramesses, hauling stones under the brutal Egyptian sun. They made bricks from mud and straw, millions upon millions of bricks, their hands blistering, their backs breaking, their spirits slowly crushed under the weight of endless, meaningless toil. Taskmasters stood over them with whips, and the Hebrew people learned what it meant to cry out with no one to hear. But still they multiplied. Despite the oppression, despite the suffering, Hebrew families continued to grow. The more the Egyptians afflicted them, the more they increased and spread. This terrified Pharaoh even more. So he turned to a different strategy, one more insidious, more evil. He called for the Hebrew midwives. Their names were Shiphrah and Puah. two women who would become the first recorded practitioners of civil disobedience in human history. Pharaoh's command was simple. When you attend Hebrew births, if the child is a boy, kill him on the birthing stool. Make it look like a complication. No one will question the word of a midwife. But if it's a girl, let her live. Girls could be assimilated, married off to Egyptians, absorbed into the empire. Boys would grow into men who might remember their heritage, who might resist, who might rebel. Shipra and Puah looked at this king, this man who considered himself divine, and they made a choice. They feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. They let the boys live. When questioned, they told Pharaoh that Hebrew women were not like Egyptian women. They were vigorous and gave birth before the midwives could arrive. It was a lie told in service of truth, a deception that saved lives. God blessed these women for their courage, giving them families of their own. But Pharaoh was not so easily thwarted. If quiet murder wouldn't work, he would make it public. He issued a decree to all his people. Every Hebrew boy born must be thrown into the Nile, not hidden away, not killed in secret, cast into the river where everyone could see, where the message would be clear. This people has no future. These children have no tomorrow. And so the screams came at dawn, day after day, week after week, month after month. The genocide continued, and the Nile, that sacred river, became complicit in the destruction of an entire generation. Mothers hid their babies as long as they could, but a newborn's cry cannot be silenced forever. Some tried to flee, but where could they run in a land where they were marked by their appearance, their accent, their very existence? Egypt had become a vast prison, and the Hebrews were dying in it. This is where our story truly begins. Not with the plagues themselves, but with the plague's necessity. Not with divine judgment falling on Egypt, but with human evil rising to such a height that heaven itself could no longer remain silent. The cries of the Hebrew mothers were not falling on deaf ears. They were shattering the gates of heaven itself, demanding an answer, requiring a response. What was happening in Egypt was not merely political oppression or economic exploitation. It was an assault on the image of God itself, for every child thrown into that river bore the divine stamp of creation. It was an attempt to thwart the purposes of the Almighty, for God had promised Abraham that his descendants would become a great nation. It was, in the truest sense, a cosmic confrontation waiting to erupt. Pharaoh sat on his throne in his palace, surrounded by luxury unimaginable to the slaves who built it. He wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. He held the crook and flail, symbols of his authority over his people. Priests burned incense before his image. Scribes recorded his words as eternal wisdom. He believed himself to be the son of Ra, the sun god, a living deity walking among mortals. His word was law. His will was absolute. He could decree death for an entire generation of children, and who would stop him? But there was one who saw, one who heard, one who remembered promises made to an old man gazing at stars too numerous to count, promises that his offspring would inherit a land, that they would become a blessing to all nations, that through them all the earth would see the glory of the true God. And that God was about to introduce himself to Egypt in a way that would never be forgotten. The stage was set for the greatest confrontation in ancient history. On one side, the mightiest empire on earth, with its vast armies, its monumental architecture, its sophisticated culture, and its pantheon of gods that numbered in the thousands. On the other side, a ragged band of slaves with no weapons, no political power, no hope except for a promise made to their ancestors centuries before. But they also had something Egypt did not. They had the God who created the Nile, not just worshipped it, the God who set the sun in the sky, not just bowed to it, the God who gives life and takes it away, who raises up nations and brings them low, who hears the cry of the oppressed and moves heaven and earth to answer. The screams of the Hebrew mothers were about to receive a reply. And when that reply came, it would shake Egypt to its foundations, topple its gods, break its power, and free a people who had forgotten what freedom even meant. The 10 plagues were not arbitrary. They were not cruel. They were the precise, measured, devastating response of infinite justice to human evil that had gone too far. Egypt was about to learn what Israel's God could do, and the lesson would be written in blood and water, in darkness and death, in judgment and in mercy. The lesson would echo through every generation that followed, a warning and a promise. The God who delivered Israel from Egypt is the God who still hears the cries of the oppressed, who still judges the proud, who still remembers his promises, and who still has the power to split seas and break empires. The story of the 10 plagues begins here, in the screams of mothers and the silence of heaven preparing to speak. But heaven was not silent. It was preparing an answer, and that answer had a name: Moses. On one of those dark mornings when Egyptian soldiers came for Hebrew babies, a mother named Jochebed made an impossible choice. She had already hidden her newborn son for 3 months, muffling his cries, keeping him concealed while her heart hammered with terror each time footsteps passed her door. But a 3-month-old baby cannot stay hidden forever. He was growing stronger, his voice louder, and she knew that discovery meant death, not just for him, but possibly for her entire family. So she wove a basket from papyrus reeds, the same reeds that grew along the Nile's banks. She waterproofed it with tar and pitch, making it seaworthy. Then she did what must have felt like surrender to the very decree she was defying. She placed her son in that basket and set it among the reeds at the river's edge, the same river where so many Hebrew boys had been thrown to drown. But she was not abandoning him. She was releasing him into the hands of a God she trusted, even when trust seemed insane, and she stationed her daughter Miriam nearby to watch what would happen. What happened was a miracle disguised as coincidence. Pharaoh's daughter came down to the Nile to bathe, accompanied by her attendants. She noticed the basket floating among the reeds. Curious, she had it brought to her. When she opened it and saw a crying baby boy, she knew immediately what he was. This was a Hebrew child, condemned to death by her own father's decree. By law, by custom, by every rule of Egyptian society, she should have looked away or called for guards to finish what the river was meant to do. Instead, she felt compassion. That single emotion rising in the heart of an Egyptian princess became the hinge upon which history would turn. She decided to keep him, to raise him, to give him a name that meant drawn out of water, a name that would prove prophetic in ways she could never imagine. She called him Moses, and through a moment of divine choreography, Miriam stepped forward and asked if the princess needed a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. Pharaoh's daughter agreed. So Moses' own mother was hired to nurse and care for him during his earliest years, years when she could whisper to him about his true identity, about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, about the promises made to their people. Then when he was weaned, she returned him to Pharaoh's daughter, and Moses entered the palace to be raised as Egyptian royalty. Imagine the strangeness of his childhood. Moses grew up in unimaginable luxury, educated by the finest teachers in the ancient world. He learned to read and write in hieroglyphics. He studied mathematics, astronomy, philosophy. He was trained in Egyptian religion, learning about Ra and Osiris, Isis and Horus, the whole elaborate pantheon that governed every aspect of Egyptian life. He ate from golden plates. He wore fine linen. He walked the same halls where his own people's oppression was planned and ordered. But somewhere deep inside, he knew he was different. Perhaps his mother's early whispers had taken root. Perhaps he simply couldn't ignore the evidence of his own eyes when he saw Hebrew slaves laboring under Egyptian whips. Whatever the reason, Moses never fully became Egyptian in his heart, even as he became Egyptian in his education and manner. The breaking point came when he was 40 years old, a man in his prime, still living in the palace but growing increasingly restless. One day he went out to watch the forced labor, to see his own people, the text says, a phrase heavy with meaning. He saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave with savage brutality. Something snapped inside Moses. He looked one way, then another, saw no one watching, and he killed the Egyptian. He hid the body in the sand, thinking his crime was secret. But murder has a way of coming to light. The next day, when Moses tried to intervene in a fight between two Hebrew men, one of them threw his deed back in his face. "Who made you a prince and judge over us? Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?" The words hit Moses like a physical blow. His secret was known, and if the Hebrews knew, Pharaoh would soon know. Sure enough, when word reached the palace, Pharaoh sought to execute Moses for murdering an Egyptian official. So Moses, who had been drawn from the Nile to escape one death sentence, now fled from Egypt to escape another. He ran to the wilderness of Midian on the eastern side of the Red Sea, leaving behind his royal robes, his education, his position, everything he had known. The prince became a fugitive. The man who might have freed his people had instead abandoned them, his one attempt at justice ending in failure and flight. In Midian, Moses sat down by a well, exhausted, alone, cut off from both worlds. He was not Egyptian enough for Egypt and not Hebrew enough for the Hebrews. He was a man without a country, without a purpose, without a future. But God often does his deepest work in people who have reached the end of themselves. 7 daughters came to the well to water their father's flocks. Shepherds tried to drive them away, but Moses, still possessing some spark of his old justice, defended the women and watered their sheep for them. Their father, a Midianite priest named Jethro, invited Moses to stay with them. Eventually, Moses married one of the daughters, Zipporah, and settled into a new life as a shepherd. For 40 years, Moses tended sheep in the wilderness. 40 years of silence, of simplicity, of watching the same hills, walking the same paths, living the rhythm of a shepherd's life. The man who had known Egyptian palaces now knew desert caves. The prince who had studied in the finest schools now studied the behavior of sheep. It must have seemed like a waste, like exile, like the slow death of every dream he might have harbored about making a difference in the world. But God was preparing him. You cannot lead people through a wilderness if you have not walked that wilderness yourself. You cannot trust God in impossible situations if you have not learned trust in the quiet, forgotten places. Moses was being stripped of his Egyptian pride, his princely self-importance, his belief that he could accomplish anything through his own strength or wisdom. The murder of the taskmaster had been Moses trying to deliver Israel his way. It had failed spectacularly. Now God would teach him a different way. On one ordinary day, Moses led his flock to the far side of the wilderness, to a mountain called Horeb. There he saw something impossible, a bush that was burning but not consumed by the flames. Fire is supposed to destroy what it touches, but this fire was different. The bush blazed and blazed, yet remained whole. Moses turned aside to investigate this strange sight, and as he approached, a voice called his name from the flames. "Moses, Moses." "Here I am," he replied. "Because what else do you say when God calls your name?" "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Moses obeyed, removing his sandals, feeling the bare earth beneath his feet, suddenly aware that he was standing on the threshold between the ordinary and the eternal. Then the voice identified itself. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Moses hid his face, afraid to look at God, And then God spoke the words that would change everything. I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. After 400 years, God was responding. After decades of screaming mothers and murdered children, heaven was breaking its silence. But then came the part that made Moses' blood run cold. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Moses, who had failed once already, who had spent 40 years learning his own inadequacy, immediately protested. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? It was the right question, actually. He was nobody, a failed deliverer, an 80-year-old shepherd, a man wanted for murder in Egypt. Who was he? And God gave the only answer that mattered. I will be with you. Not you are capable, not you are strong, not you have what it takes. Simply, I will be with you. The mission was impossible, but the God sending him was not. Still Moses resisted, throwing up objection after objection. What if the Israelites ask for your name? What do I tell them? Then God revealed something profound. I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. This was not a riddle, it was a revelation. God's name in Hebrew, Yahweh, comes from the verb to be. God is the self-existent one, the one who simply is, who needs no explanation, no justification, no source outside himself. He is the eternal present tense, the ground of all being, the one who was and is to come. Every other god and every other pantheon had origin stories, mythologies explaining where they came from. Not Yahweh. He simply is. This was the name Moses would carry back to Egypt. This was the God who would confront Pharaoh, not a regional deity, not a tribal god competing for territory, but the God who is, the source of all existence, the one before whom even mighty Egypt was nothing more than dust and pride. Moses tried a few more objections. He wasn't eloquent. The people wouldn't believe him. But God answered each protest, gave him signs to perform, and finally assigned Aaron, Moses' brother, to be his spokesman. There was no more room for argument. The shepherd was being sent back to the palace. The exile was returning to the place of his crime. The man who had failed would be given another chance, not because he was now stronger or wiser, but because the God sending him was the God who is. Moses returned to Egypt, staff in hand, 80 years old, accompanied by his brother. The prince who became a shepherd was about to become a liberator. And Egypt, mighty Egypt, with its gods and armies and pride, was about to meet the God who had drawn this one man from water so that he might draw an entire nation from slavery. The confrontation was beginning, and nothing would ever be the same. Moses walked back into Egypt carrying more than a shepherd's staff and his brother's support. He carried a declaration of war, though not the kind fought with swords and chariots. This would be a conflict between powers that transcended the physical realm, a confrontation between two entirely different understandings of reality itself. What was about to unfold along the banks of the Nile was not merely a political liberation or a humanitarian rescue. It was cosmic warfare between worldviews, and the battlefield was nothing less than the soul of civilization. To understand the plagues, you must first understand Egypt, not just as a nation or an empire, but as a religious system, a comprehensive explanation of existence that had endured for millennia. Egypt was not simply governed by religion. Egypt was religion, its entire social structure built upon an elaborate theology that touched every aspect of daily life from the moment the sun rose until it set, and even through the hours of darkness when it journeyed through the underworld. The Egyptians did not worship one god or even a handful of gods. Their pantheon numbered in the thousands, an intricate hierarchy of divine beings that reflected the complexity of the world they observed. Every force of nature, every aspect of human experience, every animal that demonstrated peculiar characteristics was understood as either divine itself or the manifestation of divine power. The universe, in Egyptian understanding, was alive with gods, and humanity's role was to maintain cosmic order through proper worship, ritual, and submission to divine authority. At the foundation of Egyptian religion stood the Nile itself, personified as the god Hapi. To call the Nile important to Egypt would be absurd understatement. The Nile was Egypt. Without its annual flooding, the land would be desert. With it, Egypt bloomed into the breadbasket of the ancient world. Every year, like clockwork, the river would rise, spill over its banks, and deposit rich black soil across the floodplain. When the waters receded, farmers would plant their crops in this gift from Hapi, and the land would yield abundance. The entire Egyptian calendar revolved around the Nile's flood cycle. The entire economy depended on it. The entire civilization existed because of it. Hapi was depicted as a pot-bellied man with heavy breasts, symbolizing the fertility and nourishment the river provided. Hymns were sung to Hapi, praising him as the bringer of food, the creator of all good things, the father and mother of Egypt. To control the Nile was to control Egypt itself. To harm the Nile was to threaten every Egyptian's survival. This was not a minor deity in a crowded pantheon. This was the source of life itself. Above the Nile, both literally and in religious hierarchy, ruled Ra, the sun god. Each day, Ra made his journey across the sky in his solar bark, a boat that carried the sun from east to west. Each night he traveled through the underworld, battling the serpent Apophis, who sought to swallow him and end the world in eternal darkness. This daily cycle was not automatic or guaranteed. It required human participation through ritual and worship to ensure that Ra would emerge victorious each dawn and continue his journey. Pharaoh himself was understood to be the son of Ra, a living god walking among mortals. When Pharaoh died, he became Osiris, the god of the underworld and resurrection. While he lived, he maintained Ma'at, the cosmic order, the balance that kept chaos at bay. His word was not merely law, it was divine decree. To rebel against Pharaoh was to rebel against the gods themselves, to invite cosmic disorder. The pyramid shape that dominated Egyptian architecture represented the rays of the sun, a permanent ladder allowing the divine Pharaoh to ascend to his father Ra. The goddess Isis, wife of Osiris and mother of Horus, was revered as the ideal of motherhood, magic, and wisdom. She was the protector of children, which makes the irony sharp when you remember that it was Pharaoh, supposedly divine, who ordered the murder of Hebrew children. The goddess who protected children had priests and devotees who threw babies into the Nile. This contradiction reveals something crucial. These gods, for all their supposed power, could not even maintain their own ethical principles in the hearts of their worshippers. Then there were the countless other deities. Khnum, the ram-headed god who fashioned humans on his potter's wheel. Heket, the frog goddess of fertility and childbirth. Hathor, the cow goddess of love and joy. Geb, the earth god. Nut, the sky goddess whose body arched over the earth. Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and writing. Anubis, the jackal-headed god of embalming and the dead. Sobek, the crocodile god who controlled the waters. Each had temples, priests, festivals, sacrifices. Each demanded attention and appeasement. This was the religious landscape Moses walked into when he returned to Egypt. A civilization that had been continuously worshipping these gods for over 2,000 years by some estimates. A system so established, so successful by its own metrics, so confident in its understanding of divine reality, that the idea of a single invisible God who demanded exclusive worship would have seemed not just wrong, but cognitively impossible. The Hebrew concept of one God who created everything, who was not part of nature but stood above and outside it, who could not be represented by any image, who entered into covenant with humans rather than simply demanding their servitude. This was radical, revolutionary, almost incomprehensible to the Egyptian mind. And this is why the plagues were not random. They were not divine temper tantrums or arbitrary shows of force. Each plague was a precision strike against specific elements of the Egyptian theological system. God was not just liberating Hebrew slaves, he was systematically dismantling Egypt's religious worldview, demonstrating that every god they trusted was powerless, that the entire cosmic order they believed in was fiction, that reality itself was different than everything their civilization had been built upon. When God turned the Nile to blood, he was not just creating a humanitarian crisis, he was declaring war on Hapi. The God who gave life would give only death. The river that sustained Egypt would sustain nothing. And Hapi, that pot-bellied deity praised in 1,000 hymns, would do nothing to stop it. When God sent darkness that could be felt, he was challenging Ra himself. The sun god who supposedly battled chaos every night and emerged victorious every morning would be defeated in the middle of the day. The light that was Egypt's guarantee of cosmic order would be snuffed out, and Ra would be revealed as impotent before the true God who created the sun, not just wrote it across the sky. Every plague that was coming would target a specific aspect of Egyptian worship. The frogs sacred to Heket would become a curse. The livestock under the protection of Hathor and Apis would die. The sky goddess Nut would rain down destruction instead of blessing. Even Pharaoh himself, the living god, would be proven mortal, powerless, defeated. This was the genius of what God was about to do. He was not asking Egypt to compare philosophical arguments. He was not sending Moses to debate theology in the palace. He was going to demonstrate through raw power and undeniable miracles that the entire Egyptian religious system was built on sand, that their gods could not protect them, that their priests could not stop what was coming, that their Pharaoh, for all his divine pretensions, was just a man who would break under the weight of true divine judgment. But there was something else at stake beyond Egypt's theology. There was the question of Israel's own faith. Remember, the Hebrews had been in Egypt for 400 years. Generations had been born and died knowing nothing but slavery, nothing but Egyptian culture, nothing but the reality of these gods who seemed to bless Egypt, while their own God remained silent. Yes, there were stories passed down about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Yes, there were promises remembered. But promises are hard to cling to when your children are being thrown into rivers and your back is bleeding from whips. The plagues would not just teach Egypt who the true God was, they would remind Israel. They would demonstrate to a people on the verge of losing their identity entirely that the God of their fathers was not a tribal legend or a comforting myth. He was real and he was powerful, and he remembered his covenant even when it seemed he had forgotten. So two worldviews stood poised for collision. On one side, Egypt with its thousands of gods, its elaborate rituals, its confident certainty that it understood how the cosmos worked, its priesthood that controlled the very calendar and seasons, its pharaoh who claimed divine blood. On the other side, one God who claimed to be the God, one shepherd with a staff, one promise made to an old man centuries earlier while he gazed at stars. The odds seemed laughable. Egypt was the superpower of the ancient world. It had survived and thrived for millennia. Its pyramids were already ancient, standing as testament to divine favor and human achievement. Its armies were legendary. Its wealth was staggering. Its cultural influence spread far beyond its borders. And it was going to be challenged by slaves, by a god no one could see, by a stuttering old man who spoke through his brother? But that, of course, was the point. When God works, he prefers impossible situations. He chooses the weak to shame the strong, the foolish to confound the wise. He waits until there is no human explanation possible, so that when deliverance comes, everyone knows it was his hand, not human effort. The stage was set. The cosmic chessboard was arranged. Moses stood before Pharaoh with a demand that would have seemed insane to any reasonable observer. "Let my people go." Behind that simple sentence was a challenge to everything Egypt believed about power, divinity, and cosmic order. And behind Moses stood the God who was about to demonstrate, through water and blood, through frogs and flies, through darkness and death, exactly who was really in control. The gods were going to war, and Egypt was about to discover that its entire pantheon was nothing more than smoke and stories before the one who spoke light into existence. The war of the gods began not with thunder and lightning, but with two old men walking into the most powerful throne room on earth. Moses had not seen Egypt's capital in 40 years. The city had changed, expanded, grown even more magnificent in his absence. The buildings that reached toward the sky, covered in hieroglyphics praising Pharaoh and the gods. The temples where incense burned day and night. The markets overflowing with goods from across the known world. The monuments that declared Egypt's permanence, its certainty that it would endure forever. Walking these streets again must have felt surreal to Moses, like returning to a dream that had turned into a nightmare. He found his brother Aaron just as God had promised he would. The reunion of two brothers separated by decades, one who had stayed and suffered with their people, one who had fled and lived in comfort among the Midianites. But there was no time for long reminiscences. They had a message to deliver, first to their own people, then to the throne. The Hebrew elders gathered when Moses and Aaron called for them. These were old men, most of them survivors who had lived long enough to see their children and grandchildren born into slavery. They had heard promises before, perhaps from other would-be deliverers who had ended up dead or disappeared. They had learned not to hope too much because hope deferred makes the heart sick, and their hearts were already sick enough. But then Aaron spoke the words God had given Moses, and Moses performed the signs. The staff that became a serpent, the hand that turned leprous, then healthy again. The water poured out that became blood on the ground. These were not tricks or illusions, these were acts of power, manifestations of the divine breaking into the physical world. And something stirred in the hearts of those old men, something they thought had died years ago. The elders believed. More than that, when they heard that the Lord had indeed seen their misery and heard their cries, they bowed down and worshipped right there. For a moment it seemed like it would be simple. God had come. Deliverance was at hand. The long nightmare was ending. But they did not yet understand the kind of war they were entering, or the cost of victory. Moses and Aaron walked into Pharaoh's presence with a directness that must have shocked the court. There were protocols for approaching divinity, rituals and bowing and careful language. But these two men simply delivered their message. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. Pharaoh's response dripped with contempt. Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. It was a theological statement as much as a political one. In Pharaoh's worldview, shaped by Egypt's elaborate pantheon, gods had jurisdictions, territories, zones of influence. If he did not know this Lord, then this Lord had no authority in Egypt. Pharaoh was the son of Ra, the living embodiment of Horus, the upholder of Ma'at. Some unknown deity worshipped by slaves had no power here, no standing, no right to make demands. Moses and Aaron tried to explain. The God of the Hebrews had met with them. They needed to take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices, or else he might strike them with plagues or the sword. It was a reasonable request, or so it seemed. Just 3 days, just to worship their God, then they would return. But Pharaoh saw through it, or thought he did. This was not about worship, this was about idleness. These slaves wanted a vacation, and they had invented a religious excuse to get it. His response was not just refusal, but punishment. That very day, Pharaoh issued new orders to the slave drivers and overseers. You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They are lazy, that's why they are crying out, let us go and sacrifice to our God. Make the work harder for the men so that they keep working and pay no attention to lies. It was a brilliant piece of cruelty. Straw was essential for brick making, mixed with mud to give the bricks strength and prevent cracking. Previously, the Egyptians had provided it. Now the Hebrew slaves would have to scatter across the fields to gather stubble, scavenging for straw on their own time, while still producing the same number of bricks each day. It was physically impossible, which was exactly the point. When they failed to meet the quota, they would be beaten, and they would understand that their situation had gotten worse, not better, because they had listened to Moses. The Hebrew overseers, the men from among their own people who supervised the work gangs, found themselves trapped in the middle. When the quotas were not met, the Egyptian slave drivers beat them. These overseers appealed directly to Pharaoh, crying out that they were being treated unfairly. But Pharaoh threw their own words back at them. Lazy, that's what you are, lazy. That is why you keep saying, let us go and sacrifice to the Lord. Now get to work. You will not be given any straw, yet you must produce your full quota of bricks. The overseers left Pharaoh's presence crushed and furious, and when they found Moses and Aaron waiting outside, their anger found its target. May the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. It was an accusation that cut deep because it was, in a sense, true. Moses' intervention had made everything worse. The people were suffering more, not less. Their hope had been raised only to be crushed under an even heavier burden. Whatever deliverance Moses had promised, the immediate reality was increased beatings, impossible quotas, and the realization that Pharaoh's power over them had only intensified. Moses was devastated. He had obeyed God. He had delivered the message. He had done exactly what the burning bush had commanded, and it had backfired spectacularly. The people hated him. The oppression had increased. Nothing about this looked like deliverance. So Moses did what anyone in his position would do. He went back to God with his complaint, his confusion, his sense of betrayal. Why, Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all. It was an honest prayer, raw and accusatory. Why did you send me if this was going to happen? Why are your people suffering more because I obeyed you? Why does it look like we're losing when you promised victory? These are the questions that everyone who has ever tried to obey God in difficult circumstances has asked. The questions that arise when faithfulness seems to produce disaster, when doing the right thing makes everything worse, when God's promises collide with brutal reality. And God answered, not with rebuke but with renewed promise. He reminded Moses of who he was, the God who had appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who remembered his covenant, the God who had heard the groaning of the Israelites in slavery and had not forgotten. Then came a declaration that would prove true but would take longer than anyone wanted. Therefore say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord. It was a promise wrapped in 7 divine actions, each one essential. I will bring you out. I will free you. I will redeem you. I will take you as my people. I will be your God. I will bring you to the land. I will give it to you. Not might, not maybe, not if circumstances align. Will. The certainty of divine intention expressed in future tense. Moses delivered this promise to the Israelites, but they would not listen to him anymore. Their spirits were crushed by cruel bondage. They had believed once and been disappointed. They had hoped and watched that hope turn to ashes. Now they simply wanted to survive the day, to meet their brick quota, to avoid the whip. Grand promises about freedom and land seemed like cruel jokes when you could not gather enough straw. This was the low point, the moment when everything seemed darkest. Moses was rejected by his own people. Pharaoh was more powerful and cruel than ever. The mission appeared to have failed before it truly began. But this is often how God works, driving the situation to a point where human effort and wisdom are clearly insufficient, where no one can claim credit for what happens next, where the only possible explanation for deliverance will be divine intervention. God told Moses to go back to Pharaoh again. Moses protested that if his own people would not listen to him, why would Pharaoh? But God was not asking for Moses' assessment of the odds. He was commanding obedience. The confrontation was not over. It had barely begun. And what was about to unfold would prove that when God makes a promise, neither Pharaoh's stubbornness nor the people's despair nor Moses' inadequacy could prevent its fulfillment. The stage was set for the plagues to begin. But this dark moment, this apparent failure, this increased suffering was part of the story too. It established that what would follow was not the result of human cleverness or strength. It would be the Lord's doing, and His alone. The people needed to be brought to the end of themselves before they could receive what only God could give. And Egypt needed to understand that it was not facing a mere slave rebellion or political insurgency. It was about to encounter the living God, and all its power, all its gods, all its confidence would crumble like bricks made without straw. The moment had come for words to give way to wonders. Moses and Aaron returned to Pharaoh's court one more time, but this time they came with more than demands. They came with demonstrations of power that would begin the systematic dismantling of everything Egypt believed about the cosmos. God had told Moses exactly what to do, exactly what would happen, and exactly what it would prove. The invisible God was about to make himself very visible indeed. Aaron threw down his staff before Pharaoh and his officials, and it became a serpent. Not a snake, the text is specific, but a serpent. Perhaps a cobra, the very symbol of Egyptian royalty that adorned Pharaoh's crown. The Uraeus, the rearing cobra, represented divine authority and protection. Now here was a staff, a simple piece of shepherd's wood, transforming into the very symbol of power that Pharaoh wore on his brow. But Pharaoh was not impressed. He summoned his wise men, his sorcerers, his magicians. These were not street performers or con artists. They were the elite practitioners of Egyptian magic, men who had spent lifetimes studying the secret arts, who served in the temples, who knew the incantations and rituals that supposedly gave humans access to divine power. And they did the same thing by their secret arts. Each magician threw down his staff, and each staff became a serpent. For a moment it might have seemed like a stalemate. Their gods could do what the Hebrew God could do. Their power matched his. But then something happened that revealed the difference between imitation and true authority. Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. Not the serpents. The text says the staffs themselves. It was a picture of complete dominance, of one power consuming and eliminating all competitors. Yet Pharaoh's heart remained hard. He turned and walked away, dismissing the entire demonstration. His magicians had matched it, more or less, and that was enough for him to maintain his position. He would not listen, just as the Lord had said. But this was only the prelude. The real confrontation was about to begin, and it would start with the most important thing in Egypt, the source of all life, prosperity, and survival: the Nile. God told Moses to meet Pharaoh at the river's edge in the morning. Pharaoh went to the water regularly, perhaps for ritual bathing, perhaps to worship Hapi, perhaps simply to survey his kingdom's lifeline. Moses and Aaron were waiting for him with the same message: "Let my people go so that they may worship me in the wilderness." And then came the warning. This is what the Lord says: "By this you will know that I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hand I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. The fish in the Nile will die, and the river will stink. The Egyptians will not be able to drink its water." It was not a request, it was an announcement. This is what will happen. This is how you will learn who the true God is. Not through philosophical debate or theological argument, but through the transformation of the Nile itself. Aaron stretched out his staff over the waters of Egypt, over the streams and canals and ponds and reservoirs, over every body of water in the land. And it all turned to blood. The text is emphatic about this. All the water in Egypt became blood. Not just the Nile, but water in storage, water in wooden buckets, water in stone jars, all of it transformed in an instant from the source of life to the substance of death. Imagine the horror of that moment. The Nile, that green-blue ribbon that had sustained Egypt for thousands of years, suddenly running red, not muddy, not discolored, blood. The fish that filled the river, the abundant source of protein that fed millions, began to die immediately. As they died, they rotted. As they rotted, they produced a stench that filled the air for miles in every direction. The smell of death emanating from the source of life. Egyptians could not drink from the Nile. They could not cook with its water. They could not water their gardens. They could not give it to their animals. The entire infrastructure of daily life, every system that depended on access to clean water, collapsed in an instant. People began digging along the banks of the Nile, desperate to find water that had filtered through the ground, hoping that seepage might somehow be clean even though the source was corrupted. But even that water turned to blood. For 7 days this continued. 7 days of thirst, 7 days of stench, 7 days of fish corpses piling up on the banks, rotting in the Egyptian sun. 7 days of a humanitarian crisis that touched every single person in Egypt, from the palace to the poorest hovel. Water is not optional. You can live weeks without food, but only days without water. Egypt was experiencing what should have been a civilization-ending catastrophe, and the theological message was impossible to miss. Hapi, the great god of the Nile, the provider, the sustainer, the father and mother of Egypt, was powerless. The river he supposedly controlled had been transformed into blood by a foreign god, and Hapi did nothing. His priests offered prayers and sacrifices, but the blood did not become water. The elaborate rituals that supposedly maintained cosmic order were revealed as empty ceremony. The god who was supposed to guarantee Egypt's prosperity had been defeated in front of the entire nation. But then Pharaoh's magicians performed the same feat with their secret arts. They too turned water into blood. It was a puzzling thing, actually, almost absurd. Egypt was dying of thirst, and the magicians proved they could make the crisis worse. They could turn clean water into blood when all water was already blood. What did this accomplish except perhaps to give Pharaoh the thinnest possible excuse to maintain his position? And that is exactly what Pharaoh did. His heart remained hard. He turned and went into his palace and did not take even this to heart. The phrase is important. He did not take it to heart. He refused to let the reality of what was happening penetrate his understanding, challenge his worldview, shake his conviction that he was in control. 7 days of blood in the water, and Pharaoh simply chose not to care. This established the pattern that would repeat through the plagues to come. God would strike. Egypt would suffer. The judgment would target a specific aspect of Egyptian religion, demonstrating the powerlessness of their gods. Pharaoh's magicians might replicate it initially, giving Pharaoh an excuse to resist, and Pharaoh's heart would harden, his will stiffening against the overwhelming evidence that he was wrong, that his gods were false, that he was not divine but merely human and stubborn. But something else was being established too. Something the Hebrews needed to see. Their God was not just more powerful than Egypt's gods. He was in a completely different category. The Egyptian gods were supposedly part of nature, manifestations of natural forces, beings who worked within the created order. The God of Israel stood outside creation, above it, commanding it, bending it to his purposes. When he spoke, the Nile obeyed. When he acted, reality itself changed. This was not magic or manipulation of spiritual forces. This was the Creator exercising authority over his creation. The Israelites scattered across Goshen heard reports of what was happening in Egypt proper. The Nile running red, the fish dying, the Egyptians digging frantically for water. But in Goshen, the Bible hints things were different. The separation was beginning, the visible demonstration that this was not a natural disaster but a targeted judgment. God was making a distinction between Egypt and Israel, between those under judgment and those under protection. For 7 days, Egypt suffered. The morning ritual of going to the river became a journey to horror. Children cried for water, animals languished. The economy ground to a halt because everything in Egypt depended on the Nile. The river that was worshipped as a god, that was praised in hymns and offerings, that was the very reason Egypt existed, had betrayed them. Or rather, it had been revealed that Hapi had never controlled it at all. And still Pharaoh would not yield. He went into his palace and shut the door, physically and metaphorically closing himself off from the crisis his stubbornness had created. He would not let the people go. He would not acknowledge the Hebrew God. He would not bend. But this was only the first plague. God was not finished demonstrating his power. He was not done dismantling Egypt's pantheon. He was not ready to let Pharaoh off with this single judgment. The blood in the water was a declaration of intent, a warning shot, a statement that said, "Everything you worship is under my control, and I am about to prove it in ways you cannot ignore or explain away." After 7 days, the water returned to normal. The blood became water again. Life in Egypt resumed, sort of. But the Nile would never look the same to anyone who had watched it run red. The god Hapi would never be praised with quite the same confidence. And Pharaoh, despite his hard heart, despite his determination to maintain his position, must have felt the first tremor of doubt, the first whisper of fear that perhaps this God he did not know was about to teach him a lesson he would never forget. The first plague had passed. 9 more were coming. And with each one, the noose would tighten around Egypt's throat, the pressure would mount, the suffering would intensify, until finally even Pharaoh's pride would shatter under the weight of divine judgment. But not yet. For now he remained defiant, and Egypt remained enslaved to a king who valued his ego more than his people's welfare, who would rather watch his nation destroyed than admit he was wrong. The blood had dried, but the war of the gods had only just begun. Egypt barely had time to recover before the second assault began. 7 days after the Nile returned to normal, Moses and Aaron appeared before Pharaoh again with the same demand and a new warning. "Let my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will send a plague of frogs on your whole country. The Nile will teem with frogs. They will come up into your palace and your bedroom and onto your bed, into the houses of your officials and on your people, and into your ovens and kneading troughs." It must have sounded almost comical at first. Frogs? After the horror of blood in the water, God was threatening frogs. But what happened next was anything but funny. It was an invasion that turned the mundane into nightmare. Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and frogs came up and covered the land. Not a few frogs. Not a plague in the sense of an unusual number. The text says they covered the land of Egypt. Millions upon millions of frogs, perhaps billions, emerging from the Nile and every body of water. Hopping through the streets, entering homes, climbing walls, seeking every crevice and corner. You could not take a step without crushing frogs. You could not sit without checking your chair first. You opened your bread oven to bake, and frogs jumped out at you. You reached into your kneading bowl to prepare dough, and your hands touched cold amphibian skin. They were in the palace, the text emphasizes. In Pharaoh's own bedroom, on his bed. The living God of Egypt could not escape them. They were on his officials, meaning the frogs climbed on people, probably seeking warmth or moisture. They were everywhere, inescapable, invasive, turning all of Egypt into a writhing, croaking chaos. The goddess Heket, who had the head of a frog and was associated with fertility and childbirth, was being mocked. Frogs were sacred in Egyptian religion, symbols of life and resurrection, because they seemed to emerge spontaneously from the Nile's mud each year after the flood. To kill a frog could bring punishment, but now these sacred creatures were a curse, and Egypt could do nothing but endure them. Pharaoh's magicians, using their secret arts, also produced frogs. Again, this seemed like a demonstration of power that only made the situation worse. Egypt was already drowning in frogs, and the magicians made more. But it gave Pharaoh his excuse, his thin justification for claiming that this was not unique divine power, but something Egyptian magic could match. Yet this time Pharaoh cracked, at least partially. He summoned Moses and Aaron and made his first concession. "Pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people, and I will let your people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord." It was an admission that the God of the Hebrews had power, that prayer to him could accomplish what Egyptian magic could not. The magicians could make frogs appear, but they could not make them leave. Moses, showing remarkable boldness, gave Pharaoh the privilege of choosing when the frogs would die. "I leave to you the honor of setting the time for me to pray for you and your officials and your people, that you and your houses may be rid of the frogs, except for those that remain in the Nile." Pharaoh chose tomorrow, perhaps wanting one more night to see if his own priests could solve the problem. Perhaps just wanting to maintain some illusion of control by setting the schedule. Moses prayed, and the Lord did what Pharaoh had requested. The frogs died. All of them, everywhere except in the Nile itself. They died in the houses, in the courtyards, in the streets, in the fields. And then came a different horror. The Egyptians piled them into heaps, and the land reeked of death. The stench of rotting frogs in the Egyptian heat must have been overwhelming. Perhaps worse than the living plague. The smell would have lingered for weeks, penetrating everything. A constant reminder of what had happened. But as soon as Pharaoh saw there was relief, he hardened his heart again. The pattern was establishing itself clearly now. Plague, suffering, concession, relief, hardening. Pharaoh's word meant nothing. His promises evaporated the moment the pressure lifted. He would not let the people go. So God escalated. The third plague came without warning to Pharaoh, no demand, no chance to negotiate. Aaron stretched out his staff and struck the dust of the ground, and throughout Egypt the dust became gnats. These were not merely annoying insects. The Hebrew word suggests tiny biting creatures, perhaps lice or fleas, parasites that attached to both people and animals. They were in the air, on the skin, in the hair, everywhere the dust had been, which meant everywhere. You could not escape them by going inside. They were already there, having materialized from the very dust on your floor. This was an assault on Geb, the earth god, showing that even the ground beneath Egypt's feet obeyed the Hebrew god, not the deity supposedly controlling it. But something else happened with this plague that marked a turning point. Pharaoh's magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, but they could not. They failed. Their power, whatever its source, had limits, and they knew it. The magicians said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." It was a remarkable admission. These were men whose entire lives, whose status and income and identity depended on their reputation as wielders of supernatural power. They served in the temples. They performed rituals for the gods. They claimed access to divine mysteries. And now they were admitting defeat, acknowledging that what Moses and Aaron were doing was beyond their capability, was in fact the direct action of deity. But even this admission from his own experts did not soften Pharaoh. His heart remained hard. He would not listen. The gnats continued to torment Egypt, but Pharaoh refused to yield. So God prepared the fourth plague, and this one would make something visible that had been true all along. God was making a distinction between Egypt and Israel. Moses delivered the warning to Pharaoh. "If you do not let my people go, I will send swarms of flies on you and your officials, on your people and into your houses. The houses of the Egyptians will be full of flies. Even the ground will be covered with them. But on that day I will deal differently with the land of Goshen where my people live. No swarms of flies will be there, so that you will know that I, the Lord, am in this land. I will make a distinction between my people and your people." The flies came as promised, dense swarms of them, probably multiple species, biting flies, disease-carrying flies, insects that made life unbearable. They filled Pharaoh's palace. They covered his officials. They invaded every Egyptian home. The land was ruined by them, the text says. Agriculture became impossible. Food spoiled. Animals were tormented. People could not work, could not rest, could not function under the constant assault of millions of flies. But in Goshen, there were no flies. The invisible border between Egyptian territory and Hebrew territory became a visible line. On one side, chaos. On the other, normal life. You could stand at the boundary and see the difference with your own eyes. This was not a natural phenomenon. Natural plagues do not respect political or ethnic boundaries. This was targeted, intentional, a demonstration that the God of Israel was protecting his people while judging their oppressors. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron again, and this time he tried to negotiate. "Go, sacrifice to your God here in the land." It was a compromise. "You can worship your God, just do it in Egypt where I can control you." But Moses refused. That would not be right. The sacrifices we offer the Lord our God would be detestable to the Egyptians. And if we offer sacrifices that are detestable in their sight, will they not stone us? It was true. The Hebrews sacrificed animals that Egyptians considered sacred. Public Hebrew worship would provoke riots. Pharaoh tried again. "I will let you go to offer sacrifices to the Lord your God in the wilderness, but you must not go very far." It was another attempt to maintain control, to keep them on a short leash. Moses agreed to pray for the removal of the flies, but warned Pharaoh not to act deceitfully again by refusing to let the people go. The flies disappeared the moment Moses prayed. Not one remained. Complete removal, instant relief. But Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also and would not let the people go. The pattern was now undeniable. Pharaoh was trapped in a cycle of his own making, unable to learn, unable to yield, unable to see that his stubbornness was destroying his own nation. 4 plagues had struck Egypt. The Nile had run with blood. Frogs had invaded every space. Gnats had materialized from the dust. Flies had ruined the land. And through it all, Pharaoh's magicians had gone from matching God's signs to failing completely, to admitting divine power, to presumably standing silently by as they realized they were spectators to a confrontation beyond their ability to influence. The gods of Egypt were being systematically humiliated. Hapi could not control the Nile. Heket's sacred frogs became a curse. Geb's earth produced plagues, and the clear distinction between Goshen and the rest of Egypt proved that this was not natural disaster but supernatural judgment. The invisible God was making himself undeniably visible through his power over creation itself. But Pharaoh would not bend. His heart was hard, whether by his own choice or by God's sovereign hardening, or most likely by both working in mysterious tandem. The king who claimed divinity was being shown his mortality, his weakness, his absolute dependence on forces beyond his control. Yet he clung to his pride, to his position, to his determination to prove that he would not be dictated to by slaves or their God. 6 more plagues were coming, and each would strike harder than the last, until finally even Pharaoh's stone heart would crack under the weight of judgment he himself had chosen. The respite after the flies was brief, and what came next struck at the very foundation of Egypt's wealth and survival. Moses appeared before Pharaoh with a message that must have sent chills through every official in the room. This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says: "Let my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go and continue to hold them back, the hand of the Lord will bring a terrible plague on your livestock in the field, on your horses, donkeys, and camels, and on your cattle, sheep, and goats." And then came the now familiar distinction. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and that of Egypt, so that no animal belonging to the Israelites will die. God even set the time. Tomorrow. Not immediately, not someday in the uncertain future, but tomorrow at a specific moment. The Lord would do this thing in the land. It was a prophecy that could be tested, verified, proven true or false within 24 hours. Either the animals would die as promised, or they would not. There was no room for ambiguity. The next day came, and the Lord did exactly what he said he would do. All the livestock of the Egyptians died. The text is emphatic about this: not some of them, not most of them, all of them. Every horse in every stable, every donkey carrying goods along the roads, every camel in every caravan, every cow in every field, every sheep in every flock, every goat grazing on every hillside. If it belonged to an Egyptian, it died. Try to comprehend the scale of this catastrophe. Egypt was an agricultural civilization, and that agriculture depended entirely on animals. Cattle pulled the plows that broke the ground for planting. Oxen turned the irrigation wheels that lifted water from the Nile to the fields. Donkeys carried goods to market and supplies to homes. Horses pulled the chariots of the military and the wealthy. Camels enabled trade across the desert routes. Sheep and goats provided meat, milk, leather, wool, all the necessities of daily life. And in one day, all of it died. The economic impact alone was staggering. Imagine the sound that must have echoed across Egypt that morning. The lowing of cattle, the braying of donkeys, the bleating of sheep. All of it rising to a crescendo, then falling silent as animal after animal collapsed. Farmers who had invested their lives in building herds watched their wealth die in front of them. Merchants who depended on pack animals to move goods found themselves suddenly unable to conduct business. The military, proud of its chariot corps, saw its mobility crippled in a single stroke. But beyond the economic devastation was the theological message. The Egyptians worshipped bulls. The Apis bull was considered a physical manifestation of the god Ptah, housed in a temple, tended by priests, honored as divine. The goddess Hathor had the head of a cow and was one of the most important deities in the Egyptian pantheon, associated with love, beauty, music, and motherhood. Throughout Egypt, cattle were sacred, protected, revered. And now they were all dead, and the gods they represented had done nothing to save them. This plague struck directly at Egypt's sense of prosperity and divine favor. A civilization's wealth in the ancient world was measured partly in livestock. The size of your herds indicated God's blessing, or in Egypt's case, the God's approval. Suddenly, Egypt had no herds, Egypt had no flocks. Egypt's wealth had been erased overnight, and the distinction between Egyptian loss and Hebrew preservation could not have been clearer. Pharaoh sent investigators. He did not trust the reports coming to him, or perhaps he hoped they were exaggerated. So he dispatched men to go to Goshen and see for themselves whether the Hebrew livestock had died. They went. They looked. They counted. And they returned with a report that must have shaken even Pharaoh's confidence. Not even one of the animals of the Israelites had died. Think about what this means. You could walk through Egyptian territory and see nothing but dead animals, corpses in fields, bodies in stables, the stench of death rising in the heat. Then you cross into Goshen, and every animal is alive and healthy. The Hebrew cattle still grazed, their sheep still produced wool, their donkeys still carried loads. The same plague that devastated Egypt had not touched them at all, even though they lived in the same land, under the same sky, breathing the same air. This was impossible to explain naturally. Disease does not respect ethnic boundaries. If a cattle plague swept through a region, it would kill all susceptible animals, regardless of who owned them. But this was not disease. This was judgment, precise and targeted, demonstrating beyond any doubt that the God of Israel had the power to protect his people while destroying their enemies. The economic implications for Egypt were catastrophic. Without draft animals, planting the next crop became exponentially harder. Without pack animals, trade ground to a halt. Without herds, the daily supply of meat and dairy disappeared. Without sacrificial animals, temple rituals could not be performed properly. The entire structure of Egyptian life had been dealt a blow that would take years to recover from, even if the plague stopped immediately. And they were not going to stop. Because despite the investigators' report, despite the undeniable evidence that this was divine action targeting Egypt while sparing Israel, despite the mounting cost of his stubbornness, Pharaoh's heart remained hard. He would not let the people go. It is worth pausing to consider the psychology at work here. Pharaoh was not stupid. He could see what was happening. He had access to all the information. His own magicians had admitted they were witnessing the finger of God. His own investigators confirmed that Hebrew animals lived while Egyptian animals died. He was watching his nation being systematically destroyed plague by plague, and he knew that one word from him could stop it. All he had to do was say yes, let the people go, but he could not, or would not. Perhaps by this point he felt trapped by his own previous refusals. To give in now would be to admit he had been wrong all along, that all this suffering could have been avoided if he had just listened the first time Moses appeared. Perhaps he convinced himself that this was a test of strength, that a true king never bends, never compromises, never shows weakness regardless of the cost. Perhaps he genuinely believed that his divine status required him to resist this foreign god, that to yield would be to betray Egypt's entire religious system. Or perhaps, most troubling of all, God was hardening Pharaoh's heart precisely so that the full measure of judgment could be poured out, so that every Egyptian god could be proven false, so that the deliverance of Israel would be so overwhelming that no one could ever question who had done it. The text says both that Pharaoh hardened his own heart and that God hardened it. Somehow, in the mysterious intersection of human will and divine sovereignty, both were true. What is certain is that by the fifth plague, the cost of pride was becoming unbearable for Egypt. Real wealth had been destroyed. Real suffering had been inflicted. This was not inconvenience anymore. This was catastrophe. Families who depended on their livestock for survival now had nothing. The poor, who could least afford the loss, suffered alongside the rich. And all of it, every dead animal, every lost fortune, every disrupted life, could be laid at the feet of one man's refusal to humble himself before a God he claimed not to know. The livestock plague revealed something essential about the nature of the confrontation. This was not primarily about the Hebrews, though they were the ostensible issue. This was about Pharaoh, about his claim to divinity, about his assertion of absolute authority, about his refusal to acknowledge any power greater than himself. God was stripping away every layer of Egyptian confidence, demonstrating that their gods were impotent, their sacred animals mortal, their prosperity fragile, their entire civilization subject to the will of one they did not worship. And still, 5 plagues in, with Egypt reeling from repeated disasters, with the distinction between Hebrew and Egyptian now visible to everyone, with his own magicians and investigators confirming what Moses had predicted, Pharaoh would not bend. The hand of the Lord had killed all the livestock of Egypt while preserving every Hebrew animal, and Pharaoh's response was to harden his heart further. 5 more plagues remained, and if the pattern held, if Pharaoh continued to resist, each one would be worse than the last. The livestock were dead, but at least they were only animals. What came next would strike at human bodies, at human comfort, at the very elements of nature, at Egyptian confidence in their God's ability to maintain cosmic order. The cost of pride was mounting with each plague, and Pharaoh was proving that there was almost no price too high to pay for refusing to admit you are wrong. The livestock lay dead in Egyptian fields, silent testimony to the power of the God who had made them and now unmade them. But in Goshen, life continued normally, Hebrew animals alive and healthy, a walking contradiction to every explanation Egypt could offer. The war of the gods was not going well for Egypt's pantheon, and the worst was yet to come. The assault on Egypt was about to become intensely personal. God instructed Moses and Aaron to take handfuls of soot from a furnace and have Moses toss it into the air in Pharaoh's presence. It was a symbolic act loaded with meaning. The furnaces of Egypt were where Hebrew slaves made bricks, where they labored under the burning sun, where their sweat mixed with clay and their backs bent under impossible quotas. Now the product of those furnaces, the very soot that represented Hebrew oppression, would become the instrument of Egyptian suffering. Moses threw the soot toward heaven, and it became fine dust over all Egypt. And wherever that dust touched skin, festering boils broke out on people and animals alike. These were not minor irritations or small blemishes. The Hebrew word describes painful burning sores, possibly with pus-filled eruptions that made movement agony. Every Egyptian woke that morning to find their skin covered with painful lesions. Children cried, adults groaned. Even the animals that had somehow survived the livestock plague, perhaps kept indoors or recently acquired, now suffered with open sores. The goddess Isis, supposedly the great healer and protector, did nothing. Sekhmet, the goddess of healing and medicine, offered no relief. Imhotep, the deified physician, could not cure what God had inflicted. The Egyptians had an elaborate medical system, sophisticated for its time, with physicians who treated various ailments through a combination of practical medicine and magical incantations. But no remedy worked against these boils, no treatment brought relief. And then came a detail that showed just how complete this judgment was. The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils. These men who had stood in Pharaoh's court through 5 previous plagues, who had attempted to match God's power, who had been Pharaoh's last line of defense against admitting divine defeat, now could not even appear in public. They were covered with boils like all the other Egyptians, their bodies erupting with painful sores, unable to perform their duties, unable to offer any counter-demonstration, unable to give Pharaoh any excuse for continued resistance. It was a humiliation that struck at the heart of their profession. Magicians were supposed to have special protection, special knowledge, special access to power that kept them safe from harm. But the boils covered them as completely as they covered anyone else. Their supposed connection to the divine realm offered them no immunity. They were just men with painful skin conditions, powerless before the God of Israel. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. Even with his own body covered in boils, even with his magicians unable to appear before him, even with every Egyptian suffering from painful sores, Pharaoh refused to yield. The pattern was becoming grotesque. No amount of suffering, whether inflicted on his people or himself, would move this man to obedience. The boils had barely begun to heal when God prepared the 7th plague, and this one came with the most extensive warning yet. Moses was told to confront Pharaoh again with a lengthy message that explained not just what would happen, but why. This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says: "Let my people go so that they may worship me, or this time I will send the full force of my plagues against you and against your officials and your people. So you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth. For by now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague that would have wiped you off the earth. But I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth." It was a stunning declaration. God was explaining his own strategy. He could have simply killed Pharaoh and all of Egypt in one stroke. He had the power. But that was not the point. The point was revelation, demonstration, proclamation. The plagues were not just punishment. They were teaching tools, cosmic lessons being etched into history so that every generation afterward would know what happened when the living God moved against human pride and false religion. Then came the specific warning. "Therefore, at this time tomorrow I will send the worst hailstorm that has ever fallen on Egypt, from the day it was founded till now. Give an order now to bring your livestock and everything you have in the field to a place of shelter, because the hail will fall on every person and animal that has not been brought in and is still out in the field, and they will die." It was an act of mercy embedded in judgment. God was warning Egypt, giving them time to protect themselves, offering a way to minimize the coming disaster. And remarkably, some Egyptians listened. Those officials of Pharaoh who feared the word of the Lord hurried to bring their slaves and livestock inside. But others who ignored the word left their slaves and livestock in the field. Even after 6 plagues, even after every prediction Moses made had come true, some Egyptians still did not take the warning seriously. Moses stretched out his staff toward the sky, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and lightning flashed down to the ground. It was the worst storm in Egypt's history, hail falling with such density and size that it killed everything exposed to it. The lightning was not ordinary either. It ran along the ground, a phenomenon that added fire to ice, destruction by burning accompanying destruction by impact. Throughout Egypt, the hail struck down everything in the fields, both people and animals. It beat down every plant and shattered every tree. The agricultural devastation was complete. Whatever crops had been growing were destroyed. The trees that provided shade and fruit were broken. The landscape was transformed into a wasteland. This plague struck at Nut, the sky goddess who supposedly controlled the heavens, showing that she had no power over what fell from those heavens. It demonstrated that the natural order Egypt believed in, the Ma'at that Pharaoh supposedly maintained, was subject to disruption by the true God. But once again, in stark contrast, the only place it did not hail was in Goshen, where the Israelites lived. You could stand at the border and see the difference. On one side, hail crashing down, lightning striking, destruction everywhere. On the other side, calm weather, crops intact, life continuing. The separation was becoming more pronounced with each plague, the visible proof that this was not nature gone wild, but judgment carefully targeted. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron urgently. The king, who had been defiant through 6 plagues, was finally breaking, at least temporarily. "This time I have sinned," he said. "The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to the Lord, for we have had enough thunder and hail. I will let you go. You don't have to stay any longer." It was the first time Pharaoh had admitted sin. The first time he acknowledged that the Lord was righteous. The first time he seemed genuinely ready to let the people go without conditions or negotiations. But Moses, who had watched this pattern repeat 6 times already, was not fooled. He agreed to pray for the storm to stop, but he added, "I know that you and your officials still do not fear the Lord God." Moses was right to be skeptical. He went out of the city and spread out his hands toward the Lord. The thunder and hail stopped. The rain no longer poured down. Complete cessation, instant relief. Egypt could breathe again. The survivors could emerge from their shelters and survey the damage. And as soon as Pharaoh saw that the rain and hail and thunder had stopped, he sinned again. His heart hardened. He would not let the Israelites go. The admission of sin had been tactical, not genuine. The acknowledgement of God's righteousness had been driven by fear, not conviction. As soon as the pressure lifted, Pharaoh reverted to his default position of stubborn resistance. His officials, who had also promised compliance under duress, followed his lead. The brief moment when Egypt seemed ready to yield evaporated as quickly as the storm clouds. 7 plagues had now struck Egypt: blood, frogs, gnats, flies, livestock death, boils, and hail. Each one had targeted aspects of Egyptian religion, economy, and daily life. Each one had proven the impotence of Egypt's gods. Each one had demonstrated the clear distinction between those under God's protection and those under his judgment, and each one had ended with Pharaoh's heart hardening further. The cost was staggering. Egypt's water had been corrupted, its land had been overrun with creatures. Its economy had been devastated by the loss of livestock. Its people bore painful boils on their skin. Its agriculture had been destroyed by the worst hailstorm in its history. The nation that had been the superpower of the ancient world was being reduced to rubble by disasters that came exactly when Moses said they would and affected exactly whom God said they would affect. Yet Pharaoh would not surrender. His brief confession of sin proved worthless. His promise to let the people go evaporated with the storm clouds. And 3 more plagues remained, each one worse than what had come before, building toward a climax that would finally break even Pharaoh's iron will and free the Hebrew slaves from 400 years of bondage. But that freedom would come at a cost so terrible that Egypt would never forget it, and Israel would commemorate it for all generations to come. The pattern of Pharaoh's hardness was becoming so destructive that even his own officials could no longer remain silent. Moses and Aaron came before Pharaoh once more with the same demand and a new threat. "This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says: How long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go so that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, I will bring locusts into your country tomorrow. They will cover the face of the ground so that it cannot be seen. They will devour what little you have left after the hail, including every tree that is growing in your fields. They will fill your houses and those of all your officials and all the Egyptians, something neither your fathers nor your ancestors have ever seen from the day they settled in this land till now." Then Moses turned and left Pharaoh's presence, a gesture of finality, of having delivered an ultimatum that required no further discussion. But before Pharaoh could respond, his officials spoke up with remarkable boldness. "How long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go so that they may worship the Lord their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" It was an extraordinary moment. These were not Hebrew slaves or foreign ambassadors. These were Pharaoh's own advisors, the men who depended on his power for their positions, who had every incentive to support him. And they were telling him, in language that bordered on insubordination, that his stubbornness was destroying the nation. Egypt is ruined. Not being damaged, not facing difficulties, ruined, destroyed, finished as a functioning civilization. They were right, of course. 7 plagues had devastated the land. The economy was shattered. The livestock were dead. The crops were destroyed. The people were suffering from boils. The water supply had been compromised. Everything that made Egypt prosperous and powerful had been stripped away. And it was all because Pharaoh refused to let a group of slaves go worship their God in the desert. The cost-benefit analysis was absurd. Egypt was paying an infinite price to maintain a position that benefited no one. So Pharaoh, pressured by his advisors, called Moses and Aaron back. "Go, worship the Lord your God, but tell me who will be going." It seemed like progress, like Pharaoh was finally ready to negotiate seriously. But Moses' answer revealed that this was still a battle of wills. "We will go with our young and our old, with our sons and our daughters, and with our flocks and herds, because we are to celebrate a festival to the Lord." Pharaoh's response dripped with sarcasm and suspicion. "The Lord be with you if I let you go along with your women and children. Clearly you are bent on evil. No, have only the men go and worship the Lord, since that's what you have been asking for." It was a transparent attempt to maintain control. Let the men go, but keep the women and children as hostages to ensure the men would return. Pharaoh was not agreeing to freedom. He was proposing a temporary religious leave under conditions that guaranteed continued bondage. Then Pharaoh had Moses and Aaron driven from his presence. No more negotiation, no more discussion. The meeting was over and the plague was coming. Moses stretched out his staff over Egypt, and the Lord made an east wind blow across the land all that day and all that night. By morning the wind had brought the locusts. They invaded all Egypt and settled down in every area of the country in great numbers. Never before had there been such a plague of locusts, nor would there ever be again. The description of this locust swarm defies imagination. They covered all the ground until it was black. You could not see the earth beneath them. They devoured everything growing in the fields and the fruit on the trees. Nothing green remained on tree or plant in all the land of Egypt. The hail had destroyed much of Egypt's vegetation, but some plants had survived, some trees still had leaves, some fields still showed signs of life. The locusts finished what the hail had started. A locust swarm in the ancient world was one of the most feared natural disasters, comparable to wildfire or flood. A large swarm could contain billions of insects moving as a single organism, darkening the sky, making a sound like thunder as their wings beat in unison. They would descend on a field and strip it completely in minutes, eating leaves, bark, roots, everything. Farmers who watched a swarm approach knew they were witnessing the destruction of everything they had worked for, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. But this was not a natural swarm that happened to pass through Egypt. This swarm came from the east at God's command. covered the entire nation with precision and ate everything green that remained after the hail. It was judgment with insect mouths, millions upon millions of tiny destroyers devouring Egypt's last hope of agricultural recovery. The god Seth, associated with chaos and storms, and the god Osiris, linked with agriculture and fertility, were powerless to stop it. Pharaoh quickly summoned Moses and Aaron again. The speed of his response suggests panic. "I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you. Now forgive my sin once more and pray to the Lord your God to take this deadly plague away from me." It was his second confession of sin, his second plea for Moses to intercede, his second promise implied by the request that he would let the people go. Moses left Pharaoh and prayed to the Lord, and the Lord changed the wind to a very strong west wind, which caught up the locusts and carried them into the Red Sea. Not a locust was left anywhere in Egypt. Complete removal again, total relief. The kind of precise miracle that proved divine intervention. A wind strong enough to blow every single locust out of Egypt and into the sea, leaving not one behind, was not a natural phenomenon. It was an answer to prayer, an act of mercy toward a nation that deserved none. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go. The same pattern, the same cycle, the same stubborn refusal despite confession, despite seeing the power of God demonstrated again, despite knowing that more plagues would come if he persisted. Pharaoh's word meant nothing. His confessions were tactical, not transformational. He would say whatever he needed to say to get relief from the current plague, then immediately revert to his position once the pressure lifted. 8 plagues had now devastated Egypt. The nation Pharaoh's advisors said was ruined was even more ruined now. Every green thing was gone. The landscape was brown and barren. Trees stood stripped and broken. Fields lay empty. There was no food growing, no prospect of harvest, no way to feed the population without importing grain from other nations, which would be both expensive and humiliating for a country that prided itself on agricultural abundance. The psychological impact must have been as devastating as the physical. The Egyptians had watched plague after plague strike exactly as Moses predicted. They had seen their gods proven powerless. They had experienced the clear distinction between Egyptian suffering and Hebrew protection. They had heard their own king confess sin twice, promise relief, then harden his heart again. They knew that this conflict was not ending, that more disasters were coming, and that their leader was willing to watch Egypt burn rather than humble himself before the Hebrew God. Some Egyptians must have been furious at Pharaoh. Others perhaps still trusted that he knew what he was doing, that maintaining control over the Hebrew slaves was worth any price, that yielding to their demands would somehow be worse than continued plagues. But the evidence was overwhelmingly against Pharaoh's position. Egypt was objectively worse off with each plague. The cost of his pride was not theoretical anymore. It was empty fields and dead animals and painful boils and shattered trees and empty storehouses. Yet he would not bend. Could not bend, perhaps. There is a point in human stubbornness where admitting you were wrong becomes psychologically impossible. When you have invested so much in a position, when you have caused so much suffering in defense of it, when you have looked at mounting evidence against you and still refuse to change, the cognitive dissonance becomes unbearable. To admit error would be to admit that all this suffering was unnecessary, that all these disasters were your fault, that you destroyed your own nation for nothing more than pride. So Pharaoh hardened his heart, and Egypt remained in bondage to a king who valued his ego more than his people's survival. The locusts were gone, but they had eaten everything green. The land was bare, the people were hungry, the economy was destroyed, the gods were silent. And 2 more plagues remained, the final acts in this cosmic drama. judgment so severe that they would finally break even Pharaoh's will and send the Hebrews out of Egypt with such urgency that there would be no time even to let bread rise. But before that freedom came, Egypt would experience darkness that could be felt and death that would pierce every home. The cost of pride was about to reach its terrible climax. The ninth plague was different from all that had come before, and its difference lay not in what it destroyed, but in what it removed. Moses stretched out his hand toward the sky, and total darkness covered all Egypt for 3 days. But this was not merely the absence of light. The text describes it as darkness that could be felt, a thick, oppressive, almost tangible blackness that pressed in on the Egyptians from all sides. No one could see anyone else or leave their place for 3 days. People were trapped wherever they happened to be when the darkness fell, immobilized by a supernatural night that would not end. Imagine the terror of that experience. You are going about your day when suddenly the light disappears. Not gradually like sunset, but instantly, as if someone had snuffed out the sun like a candle flame. You reach out your hand and cannot see it in front of your face. You call out to family members in the next room and hear their voices but cannot move toward them because the darkness is so complete you cannot navigate. You sit down where you are and wait for dawn, but dawn does not come. Not that day, not the next day, not the day after that. The psychological impact would have been devastating. Humans are diurnal creatures. We need light to function, to orient ourselves, to maintain our sense of time and normality. 3 days of utter darkness would have felt eternal, like being buried alive, like the world had ended and you were trapped in some netherworld. Children would have cried endlessly. Adults would have battled panic. The darkness would have invaded minds as completely as it filled the air, bringing with it primal fears that civilization usually keeps at bay. But this plague was not just about human suffering. It was a direct assault on Ra, the sun god, the supreme deity of the Egyptian pantheon. Ra was not some minor god with a limited portfolio. He was the king of the gods, the creator who had spoken the world into existence, the deity whose daily journey across the sky in his solar bark maintained cosmic order. Every morning when the sun rose, it was Ra emerging victorious from his nightly battle with Apophis, the serpent of chaos who tried to swallow him in the underworld. Egyptian religion taught that this cycle was not automatic. It required human worship, proper rituals, and Pharaoh's maintenance of Ma'at to ensure Ra would continue his journey. And now Ra had been defeated, not by Apophis in the underworld, but by the God of the Hebrews in the middle of the day. The sun did not set and then fail to rise. The sun simply disappeared, blotted out, cancelled, as if Ra himself had been overpowered by a force he could not resist. Every Egyptian belief about cosmic order was shattered in that darkness. If Ra could be defeated, if the sun itself could be extinguished, then nothing was secure. The entire Egyptian worldview, built on the premise that their gods controlled nature and maintained creation, collapsed under the weight of 3 days without light. The priests of Ra must have been frantic. They would have performed every ritual in their extensive repertoire. They would have offered sacrifices, recited prayers, burned incense, done everything their tradition taught them to do, to assist Ra in his battles, but nothing worked. The darkness remained absolute. The sun did not return. Ra did not answer. And in that silence, the priests must have understood what the magicians had admitted several plagues earlier. They were not facing a rival god they could appease or negotiate with. They were facing the Creator himself, the one who had made the sun and could unmake it at will. But in stark and undeniable contrast, all the Israelites had light in the places where they lived. Not sunlight necessarily, but light. Perhaps lamplight, perhaps some supernatural illumination, but enough to see by, enough to go about daily activities, enough to demonstrate yet again that this darkness was not natural but targeted. You could walk to the border between Egyptian territory and Goshen and see the difference with your own eyes if you could get there through the darkness. On one side, blackness so thick you could feel it. On the other side, light enough to live by. The Egyptians trapped in their homes had 3 days to think about what was happening. 3 days to understand that their entire civilization had been brought to its knees by a god they did not worship. 3 days to wonder if the light would ever return or if this was the new permanent reality. 3 days to hear, perhaps dimly through the darkness, the sounds of Hebrew life continuing normally in Goshen. People talking, children playing, the ordinary sounds of a community not under judgment. When the darkness finally lifted, Pharaoh summoned Moses again. The king was clearly shaken. He had sat in that darkness like everyone else, unable to see, unable to function, forced to confront his own helplessness. And this time he made what seemed like a genuine concession. Go, worship the Lord. Even your women and children may go with you. Only leave your flocks and herds behind. It was the closest Pharaoh had come to full surrender. Take everyone, just leave the animals. Perhaps he thought that keeping their livestock would ensure they would return, or perhaps he simply could not bear to give up everything. But Moses, perhaps sensing that they were close to complete victory, refused to compromise. You must allow us to have sacrifices and burnt offerings to present to the Lord our God. Our livestock too must go with us. Not a hoof is to be left behind. We have to use some of them in worshiping the Lord our God. And until we get there, we will not know what we are to use to worship the Lord. It was a reasonable argument. How could they worship God without animals to sacrifice? But more than that, it was a declaration that this was not negotiable anymore. Either Pharaoh would let them go completely on their terms, or he would not let them go at all. There would be no partial freedom, no conditional release, no compromise that still left them under Pharaoh's control. And at that moment, something in Pharaoh snapped. The Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he was not willing to let them go. But more than that, Pharaoh's fury boiled over into a threat that revealed how close they were to the breaking point. Get out of my sight. Make sure you do not appear before me again. The day you see my face, you will die. Moses agreed. Just as you say. I will never appear before you again. It was a mutual acknowledgement that the negotiation phase was over. There would be no more meetings, no more pleas, no more opportunities for Pharaoh to change his mind under pressure, then harden his heart again when relief came. Whatever happened next would happen without warning, without chance for reprieve, without any more merciful offers of escape. 9 plagues had struck Egypt. The nation was destroyed economically, agriculturally, psychologically. Its water had been corrupted. Its land had been overrun. Its livestock had died. Its people bore scars on their skin. Its crops were gone. Its light had been taken away. Every plague had proven the impotence of Egypt's gods. Every plague had demonstrated the clear distinction between Egyptian judgment and Hebrew protection. Every plague had given Pharaoh a chance to yield, and every time he had refused or relented temporarily, then hardened his heart again. The darkness had been the final warning, the last demonstration short of ultimate catastrophe that the God of Israel was supreme over all creation, even over the sun itself. If Pharaoh could not learn from 9 plagues, if even 3 days of supernatural darkness pressing in on him had not taught him humility, then there was only one plague left, one final judgment so terrible that it would break even his stone heart and send the Hebrews running from Egypt. Moses walked out of Pharaoh's presence for the last time, knowing they would not meet again until Pharaoh himself came begging in the middle of the night, his own son dead, his nation shattered beyond recovery, his pride finally broken under the weight of a judgment he had chosen by his stubborn refusal to acknowledge a God greater than himself. The cosmic war was reaching its climax, and Ra himself had been defeated by the one who created light in the first place and could extinguish it at will. One plague remained, and after it nothing in Egypt would ever be the same. But before Moses left Pharaoh's presence that final time, he delivered one more message, and this one would change everything. The Lord had spoken to Moses, revealing the 10th and final plague, the judgment so severe that it would accomplish what 9 devastating disasters had not. And Moses, standing before Pharaoh after being threatened with death if he ever returned, spoke with a fury that came from watching this stubborn king destroy his own nation for pride. This is what the Lord says: "About midnight I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sits on the throne, to the firstborn son of the female slave who is at her handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again. But among the Israelites not a dog will bark at any person or animal. Then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel." The pronouncement hung in the air like a death sentence, which is exactly what it was. Not a natural disaster this time, not an environmental plague or an agricultural catastrophe. Death itself would walk through Egypt at midnight, and every firstborn would fall. The heir to Pharaoh's throne, the children of nobles and officials, the sons of common people and slaves, even the firstborn of animals, an entire generation of eldest children gone in one night. Moses continued, his anger evident. "All these officials of yours will come to me, bowing down before me and saying, 'Go, you and all the people who follow you.' After that I will leave." Then Moses, hot with anger, left Pharaoh's presence. It was a prophecy and a promise. Pharaoh himself, who had just threatened Moses with death, would soon be begging him to leave along with all his officials. The same men who had advised him to let the people go after the locusts, but had watched him harden his heart again. The Lord said to Moses, "Pharaoh will refuse to listen to you, so that my wonders may be multiplied in Egypt." It was a statement of divine purpose. All of this, the entire sequence of plagues, the repeated hardening of Pharaoh's heart, the escalating judgments, had been designed to multiply God's wonders, to demonstrate his power so completely that no one could ever question what had happened. When Israel told this story to their children and their children's children, they would speak of a God who had defeated the greatest empire on earth, who had broken the power of Egypt's gods, who had delivered his people with signs and wonders that shook the world. But now God gave Moses different instructions. Not threats to deliver to Pharaoh, but commands to give to the Israelites. They were to prepare for something unprecedented, for deliverance that would come on the same night as judgment, for freedom that required their participation through specific, careful obedience. Each family was to take a lamb, a year-old male without defect. It could be a lamb or a young goat, but it had to be perfect, unblemished, valuable. They were to keep it until the 14th day of the month, caring for it, watching it, letting it become familiar. Then at twilight, all the people of the community of Israel were to slaughter the lambs at the same time. The instructions became more specific and more strange. They were to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of their houses. Not inside, where only they could see it. On the outside, on the doorposts and lintel, visible to anyone passing by. The blood was to be a sign, a mark of protection, a declaration that this house belonged to those under God's covenant. Then they were to roast the meat and eat it that night, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Nothing about this meal was to be casual or comfortable. They were to eat it with their cloak tucked into their belt, their sandals on their feet, their staff in their hand. They were to eat in haste, dressed for travel, ready to leave at a moment's notice. This was the Lord's Passover, God explained, a meal eaten on the edge of deliverance, a feast consumed while judgment fell outside. On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. It was a covenant of blood, a promise of protection marked by sacrifice. The lamb would die so the firstborn could live. The blood on the doorpost would signal to the angel of death to pass over that house, to leave its occupants untouched while Egypt experienced the culmination of all the judgment that Pharaoh's stubbornness had brought upon his nation. The Israelites were told to commemorate this day for the generations to come, to celebrate it as a lasting ordinance. They were to eat unleavened bread for 7 days, removing all yeast from their houses. When their children asked what this ceremony meant, they were to explain, "It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians." The instructions were precise, detailed, non-negotiable. Every element mattered. The perfect lamb, the blood on the doorposts, the roasted meat eaten with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. The posture of readiness, sandals on, staff in hand. This was not merely a religious ritual. This was a rescue operation, and their obedience to these specific commands would mark the difference between life and death, between remaining in slavery and walking out free. The symbolism was profound, though its full meaning would not be understood for centuries. A perfect, unblemished sacrifice, blood that protected from judgment. Salvation that came through death, through the substitution of the Lamb's life for the lives inside. It was a picture that would echo through all of Scripture, finding its ultimate fulfillment in another Passover meal, another perfect sacrifice, another moment when blood would mark the difference between death and life. But for the Hebrews receiving these instructions, the meaning was immediate and practical. They were to take the lamb, inspect it for defects, keep it for 4 days, kill it at twilight, apply its blood to their doorframes, roast and eat it that night with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Get dressed for travel and wait for midnight. Wait for the sound of wailing that would rise from every Egyptian home. Wait for the moment when Pharaoh's resistance would finally shatter and the door to freedom would swing open. The people bowed down and worshipped when they heard these instructions. After 9 plagues, after watching their situation get worse before it got better, after seeing Pharaoh's repeated promises broken, they believed. They understood that this time was different, that the 10th plague would be the last, that their 400 years of bondage were about to end in a single night of judgment and deliverance. So they went and did just as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron. Each family selected their lamb. They kept it, examined it, prepared for the moment of slaughter. They made bread without yeast, knowing there would be no time for it to rise. They packed what they could carry, gave away or abandoned what they could not. They gathered their children and explained as best they could what was about to happen. They told stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, reminding themselves of the promises God had made to their ancestors, promises that were about to be fulfilled in a way none of them could have imagined. And as the 14th day of the month approached, as twilight came and the lambs were slaughtered and the blood was applied to the doorposts, as the Israelites gathered in their homes dressed for travel and ate their meal standing up with staffs in hand, Egypt went about its evening unaware that midnight would bring a horror beyond anything the previous 9 plagues had inflicted. The firstborn sons of Egypt, from the palace to the prison, slept in their beds, not knowing that many of them would not see morning. Pharaoh sat on his throne, still convinced that his will would prevail, still believing that he could outlast this conflict, still refusing to acknowledge the God who was about to teach him a final devastating lesson about the cost of pride and the reality of divine judgment. The stage was set for the 10th plague, and after it, nothing would ever be the same. Midnight came, and with it came death. The Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. It happened simultaneously, in one terrible instant, across the entire nation. In palaces and prisons, in mansions and mud huts, in cities and villages, in every Egyptian home from the northern delta to the southern border, the firstborn died. There was no warning, no dramatic build-up, no time to prepare or protect or plead. The angel of death moved through Egypt at the appointed hour, and where there was no blood on the doorposts, death entered and took what God had declared would be taken. Sons who had gone to sleep healthy woke their parents with cries of pain, then fell silent. Infants stopped breathing in their mother's arms. Young men who were their father's pride and hope died in their beds. The heirs of Egypt, an entire generation of firstborn children, passed from life to death in moments. And then came the screaming. Pharaoh woke in the night to a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It started in his own palace, the cry of servants discovering that the crown prince, his firstborn son, the heir to the throne of Egypt, was dead. The boy who had been raised to believe he was divine, who had been groomed to inherit godhood from his father, who represented the continuity of Egypt's royal line stretching back thousands of years, was gone. Dead in his bed with no mark, no wound, no explanation except the one Moses had given. But Pharaoh's household was not alone in its grief. The wailing spread through the palace complex as official after official discovered their own firstborn sons dead. Then it echoed from the city beyond the palace walls. From every home, from every street, from every quarter of the capital, the screaming rose. And it was not just the capital. Across all Egypt, from every town and village, the same sound erupted simultaneously as the magnitude of the catastrophe became clear. There was not a house without someone dead, not one. The poorest family mourning their oldest child, the wealthiest noble mourning his heir. The prisoner in the dungeon who had nothing else in the world had lost his firstborn. The female slave at her hand mill, grinding grain in endless servitude, found her child dead. Even the livestock, the animals that had somehow survived the 5th plague or been acquired since, lost their firstborn. The death was comprehensive, unstoppable, exactly as Moses had warned. But in Goshen, in the homes of the Israelites, there was no death. The families who had obeyed God's commands, who had sacrificed the lamb and applied its blood to their doorposts, who had eaten the Passover meal dressed for travel, sat in their homes and listened to the wailing from Egypt. They heard the screaming. They understood what was happening. And they knew that the blood on their doorframes had saved them, that the angel of death had passed over their houses, that while judgment fell on Egypt, they remained untouched. The contrast could not have been more stark. Egyptian homes filled with corpses and mourning. Hebrew homes filled with living children and awed silence. The distinction God had been making through 9 plagues had reached its ultimate expression. This was not about ethnicity or favoritism. It was about covenant and obedience. The blood marked those who belonged to God, who trusted His word, who followed His commands. And that blood, the blood of a lamb sacrificed in their place, had meant the difference between life and death. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron during the night, not in the morning, not at a scheduled audience. In the middle of the night, while Egypt screamed around him, while his own son lay dead, while his officials mourned and his people wailed. He sent for the men he had threatened with death just hours earlier, the men he had sworn would never enter his presence again. Pride was gone now. Defiance had evaporated. All that remained was a broken king confronting the devastating consequence of his own stubbornness. Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go, and also bless me." Every word was a surrender. Up, leave, immediately, no delays, no negotiations, no conditions. Take everything, the people, the animals, all of it, just go. And that final plea, "Bless me also," revealed Pharaoh's complete reversal. The man who had claimed divinity, who had said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him?" was now begging for a blessing from the God he had denied. He wanted Moses to pray for him, to intercede, to ask this God he had fought against to show him mercy. It was the acknowledgement Pharaoh should have made after the first plague, the humility he should have shown when the Nile turned to blood. But it had taken 10 plagues and the death of his own son to break through his hardness. Everything Moses had warned would happen had happened. Every plague had struck exactly as predicted. Every opportunity to avoid this final catastrophe had been offered and rejected. And now, in the darkness of midnight, surrounded by death, Pharaoh finally yielded. The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country. For otherwise, they said, "We will all die." The population was in panic. If the firstborn had died in one night, what would happen the next night? Would it be the second-born? Would it be everyone? The Egyptian people, who had watched their gods proven powerless and their land destroyed, who had endured 9 plagues only to see their children killed in the 10th, wanted the Hebrews gone. Not because they hated them anymore, but because they feared that Israel's presence would bring more judgment. Get them out. Send them away. Before we all die. 400 years of slavery ended in a single night. 4 centuries of oppression, of brickmaking, of taskmasters and whips, of children thrown into the Nile, of suffering that seemed like it would never end, terminated abruptly because judgment finally fell with such weight that even Pharaoh's stone heart cracked. The people who had arrived in Egypt as 70 honored guests, who had been enslaved by a king who did not know Joseph, who had cried out to God under the burden of their bondage, were suddenly free. But this freedom had come at a terrible cost to Egypt. The wailing continued through the night and into the morning. Families prepared bodies for burial, bodies of children who should have lived decades longer. Fathers mourned sons who would never inherit their names. Mothers held children who would never grow up. The firstborn of Egypt, from the palace to the prison, lay dead because one man had refused to humble himself before God. And the theological message was impossible to miss. God had called Israel his firstborn son. Pharaoh had refused to let God's firstborn go free, so God had taken Pharaoh's firstborn. The judgment was proportional, precise, devastating. "You harm my son, I will take yours. You enslave my people, I will break your power. You deny my existence, I will demonstrate my reality in a way you will never forget." But even in this ultimate judgment, there was mercy woven through. The Passover lamb had provided a way of escape. The blood on the doorposts had offered protection. God had not simply decreed death for all firstborn. He had provided a substitute, a sacrifice, a means of salvation for those who would trust and obey. The Egyptian firstborn died because Egypt had rejected God's ways. The Hebrew firstborn lived because their parents had accepted God's provision. As dawn broke over Egypt, the contrast between the two peoples was total. Egyptians buried their dead and mourned their losses. Israelites gathered their possessions and prepared to leave. The night of the 10th plague had divided history. Everything before it was slavery. Everything after it was freedom. And the blood of a lamb had marked the boundary between judgment and mercy, between death and life, between bondage and deliverance. Pharaoh's son was dead. Egypt's gods were defeated. The nation's pride was shattered. And Israel, after 400 years, was walking free because God had finally demonstrated through blood and death, through judgment and mercy, through plagues and protection, that He alone was Lord, that His power was absolute, that his promises were certain, and that those who stood against him would be broken, no matter how mighty they appeared, no matter how long they resisted, no matter what price they forced their own people to pay for their stubborn pride. The magnitude of what happened next defies easy comprehension. The Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Sukkoth. There were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. That phrase, besides women and children, transforms the numbers from impressive to staggering. If there were 600,000 men of military age, then including women, children, and elderly, the total population was likely between 2 and 3 million people. Some scholars suggest it could have been even more. Think about what it means to move 2 million people at once. This was not an organized evacuation with modern logistics and transportation. This was families gathering their belongings, herding their animals, carrying their children, walking on foot across the desert. The column of people would have stretched for miles, tens of miles, perhaps longer. If they walked in rows 1,000 people wide, the column would still have been several miles long. The dust they raised would have been visible for vast distances. The sound of 2 million people moving, talking, crying, singing would have been like the roar of the ocean. And they did not leave empty-handed. The Israelites had done as Moses instructed. They had asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. And the Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, so they gave them what they asked for. The Hebrews plundered Egypt, the text says, not through violence but through willing transfer. The Egyptians, desperate to see the Israelites gone before another plague struck, gave them whatever they requested. Family treasures, jewelry, fine garments, precious metals. The wealth of Egypt flowed into Hebrew hands as a form of back payment for 400 years of unpaid labor. This, too, was fulfillment of prophecy. God had told Abraham that his descendants would be enslaved in a foreign land, but they would come out with great possessions. Now it was happening exactly as predicted. The slaves who had owned nothing, who had been property themselves, were leaving as the wealthiest refugee population in history. They carried the spoils of Egypt on their backs and drove Egyptian livestock before them. Many other people went up with them, and also large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. This detail is significant. The Exodus was not purely an ethnic migration. Other people, presumably non-Israelites who had witnessed the plagues and recognized the power of Israel's God, chose to leave Egypt and join themselves to the Hebrew nation. There were also livestock in massive numbers. The animals that had survived or been acquired after the 5th plague, the flocks and herds that Pharaoh had tried to keep in Egypt but finally released. The people baked unleavened bread from the dough they had brought from Egypt, for it had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. The urgency of the departure was evident. No time to let bread rise, no time for proper provisions. They left with whatever they could grab, eating bread without yeast because there had been no time for fermentation. The meal they had eaten standing up, dressed for travel with staffs in hand, had been prophetic. The departure had come exactly as God said it would, sudden and urgent in the middle of the night, with Pharaoh and the Egyptians begging them to leave. Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt. It was a night to remember. This night, when the Lord brought them out of Egypt. The number is precise, the timing exact. God does not operate on vague schedules or approximate timelines. 430 years earlier, Jacob and his family had entered Egypt. Now, to the very day their descendants were leaving. The covenant had been kept. The promise had been fulfilled. The time of slavery had ended on schedule, even though it had seemed endless while it was being endured. But as the massive column of Israelites moved away from Egypt, God began to lead them in a way that would seem From a human perspective, completely illogical. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. The coastal route was the most direct path from Egypt to Canaan, well-traveled with established water sources and trading posts. It was the highway of the ancient world. If the goal was simply to get the Israelites to the promised land quickly, this would have been the obvious choice. But God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. The Israelites, despite having witnessed 10 plagues, despite walking out of Egypt free, despite carrying its wealth, were still a slave people in their psychology. They had no military training, no experience with warfare, no confidence in their ability to fight. If they encountered the Philistines, a warrior people who controlled the coastal region, the Israelites might panic and decide that slavery in Egypt was preferable to death in battle. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. By day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. The cloud and fire were not metaphorical or symbolic. They were visible, physical manifestations of God's presence, a massive column of cloud that moved before them during the day, providing shade from the desert sun, showing them which direction to travel. At night it became fire, illuminating the darkness, allowing them to continue their journey, demonstrating that the God who had defeated Egypt's sun god now provided his own light for his people. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. It was constant, unchanging, a perpetual reminder that they were not wandering aimlessly through the desert, but following God himself. Where the pillar moved, they moved. Where it stopped, they stopped. It was leadership that was impossible to misinterpret or ignore. No human guide, no committee making decisions, just the visible presence of God showing them exactly where to go. But the route God chose seemed increasingly strange. Instead of heading northeast toward Canaan, they were moving southeast, deeper into the wilderness toward the Red Sea. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea directly opposite Baal Zephon." It was a trap, but not for the Israelites. God was deliberately positioning them in a location that would look, from a military perspective, like a fatal mistake. They would be camped between the sea and the desert, with mountains on either side. There would be no escape route if an army approached from behind. Any military strategist looking at their position would see a force that had trapped itself, that had made a blunder so obvious that defeat was certain. And God explained why. Pharaoh will think, the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, but I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. 10 plagues had not been enough. Egypt needed one more lesson, one final demonstration of God's power that would be so overwhelming, so undeniable, that it would echo through history for all time. The Israelites needed to learn that the God who brought them out of Egypt could also protect them against Egypt's armies. And Pharaoh, whose heart was hardening again even as his son's body lay in a tomb, needed to be confronted one more time with the reality that he was not divine, not powerful, not in control of anything, not even his own fate. So the Israelites did as God commanded. They moved to the location by the Red Sea, the place that looked like a dead end, the position that seemed indefensible. They set up camp with the water at their backs and the wilderness around them. 2 million people in a geographical trap, seemingly vulnerable, apparently confused, looking like easy prey for any army that might come after them. And back in Egypt, as Pharaoh buried his son and surveyed the ruins of his nation, as he thought about the slaves who had escaped with Egypt's wealth, As his officials reminded him of what had been lost, his heart began to harden again. The grief was still fresh. The memory of the plagues was still vivid. But pride has a way of reasserting itself, of rewriting recent history, of convincing a man that he can still win even after he has clearly lost. One more confrontation was coming, the final showdown between Pharaoh and the God he refused to acknowledge, and this time it would end not just in defeat but in drowning. The king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, and Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." The regret came quickly, too quickly for a man who had just buried his firstborn son. But grief and reason do not always coexist, and Pharaoh's pride was apparently stronger than both. He looked at the devastation around him, at the plundered wealth, at the abandoned construction projects, at the fields with no one to work them, and something in him rebelled against the idea that the Hebrews had won, that slaves had dictated terms to him, that he had been forced to surrender. So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. This was not a minor pursuit force. This was the military might of Egypt, the pride of Pharaoh's army, the elite chariot corps that had made Egypt feared throughout the region. 600 of the finest chariots plus additional forces, all commanded by officers, all racing across the desert after the fleeing Israelites. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites, who were marching out boldly. But this boldness would soon turn to terror. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-Hahiroth, opposite Baal-Zephon. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. The sight must have been horrifying. The dust cloud on the horizon growing larger, the sound of chariot wheels thundering across the desert, the realization that Egypt's army was coming and the Israelites were trapped against the sea with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Then they turned on Moses with the bitter sarcasm of people facing death. "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." It was the first sign of a pattern that would repeat throughout Israel's journey. The tendency to romanticize slavery when freedom became difficult, to forget the horror of what they had escaped when faced with new challenges. They had watched 10 plagues destroy Egypt. They had seen the angel of death pass over their homes. They had walked out of Egypt free and wealthy. But now, with chariots approaching and water blocking their escape, all of that was forgotten. They blamed Moses. They wished they had stayed in Egypt. They were certain they were about to die. Moses answered the people with words that would become foundational to Israel's understanding of salvation. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." It was a command to trust, to stop panicking, to watch what God would do. The battle was not theirs to fight. The solution was not theirs to devise. Their role was simply to stand still and witness the salvation of the Lord. The Egyptians they feared, the army that seemed invincible, would be dealt with not by Hebrew weapons but by divine intervention. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground." Standing still meant trusting, not paralysis. God was about to open a path and they needed to be ready to walk through it. Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. The same pillar that had led Israel now protected them. The cloud that had given them guidance now gave them defense, but it operated differently for the two armies. For the Israelites there was light. For the Egyptians there was darkness so complete they could not advance. The Egyptians found themselves unable to attack, unable even to see, held back by supernatural intervention while God prepared the path of escape. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. Try to imagine the scene. 2 million people walking between walls of water. The sea, which should have been a barrier, had become a highway. The ocean floor, which should have been mud, was dry ground solid enough to walk on. On either side, water stood in vertical walls held in place not by physics but by divine power. The Israelites walked through what should have been impossible, their feet on dry land, the same water that had trapped them now providing their escape route. The crossing took all night. 2 million people with children and elderly and livestock moving through the divided sea. Every person who walked that path knew they were experiencing a miracle. Every step was a declaration of trust, because the water could collapse at any moment. The walls of sea on either side were a constant reminder of their vulnerability and God's power. They walked through death, essentially through what should have killed them, and found it transformed into the path of life. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. It was madness driven by pride. The Egyptians saw the Israelites escaping through the sea and decided to follow. Perhaps they thought that if the sea could be divided for the Hebrews, it would hold for them as well. Perhaps they were so focused on recapturing their slaves that they did not consider the danger. Perhaps Pharaoh's hardened heart had infected his entire army with irrational determination. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Too late they understood. Too late they recognized that they were not fighting slaves but God Himself. The wheels of their chariots, their technological advantage, became their disadvantage as they jammed and broke. The mobility that made chariots effective became immobility that trapped them. They tried to retreat, to escape back to Egypt, but they were caught in the middle of the sea. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. The same water that had provided salvation for Israel brought judgment on Egypt. The sea that had been split to create a path closed to create a grave. Egypt's military might, the chariots and horsemen and officers, all of it disappeared beneath the waves in moments. Pharaoh's army was destroyed. Egypt's power was broken. The nation that had oppressed Israel for 4 centuries could oppress them no more. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. The contrast was absolute. Israel alive on the far shore, Egypt dead in the water, salvation and judgment through the same miracle, the same divided sea providing both life and death depending on which side you were on. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. Then Moses and the Israelites sang a song to the Lord. It was Israel's first worship service as a free people, and it took the form of a song celebrating what God had done. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my defense. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has hurled into the sea. Miriam the prophet, Aaron's and Moses' sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women followed her, with timbrels and dancing. Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea." It was celebration, but it was also theology. Salvation through water, judgment through water. The same element doing double work, providing a path for those under covenant and death for those in rebellion. The pattern would repeat throughout Scripture. Noah and his family saved through water while the world was judged. Israel passing through the Red Sea while Egypt drowned. Eventually, baptism would echo this same truth. Identification with the Messiah through water symbolizing death to the old life and resurrection to the new. Water is both grave and womb, ending and beginning, judgment and salvation. The 10 plagues were complete. Egypt was defeated. Israel was free. And standing on the far shore of the Red Sea with the bodies of their enemies visible in the water, the Hebrews finally understood what it meant to be delivered by the hand of God. But now, as the sound of celebration fades and the waters of the Red Sea settle back into their eternal rhythm, we must ask ourselves what all of this meant, what it means still, and what it will always mean for those who hear this ancient story echoing across the centuries. The 10 plagues were not random acts of divine anger or arbitrary demonstrations of power. They were a systematic dismantling of an entire worldview, a theological education delivered through judgment, a revelation of truth that could only be communicated through the collapse of falsehood. Each plague struck at the heart of Egyptian religion, exposing the impotence of gods who had been worshipped for millennia. When the Nile turned to blood, Hapi, the river god, was revealed as powerless. The source of Egypt's life became the carrier of death, and the deity supposedly controlling it did nothing. When frogs swarmed from that same river, Heket, the frog goddess, was mocked by the very creatures she represented, becoming a curse rather than a blessing. When gnats emerged from the dust, Geb, the earth god, demonstrated no control over his own domain. When flies invaded, the elaborate pantheon of protective deities offered no protection. When livestock died, Hathor, the cow goddess, and Apis, the bull god, could not save their sacred animals. When boils erupted, Isis, the healer, and Sekhmet, the goddess of medicine, proved unable to cure. When hail fell mixed with fire, Nut, the sky goddess, showed no authority over the heavens. When locusts devoured everything green, Osiris, the god of agriculture, could not preserve a single plant. When darkness covered the land, Ra, the supreme sun god, was defeated in his own realm. And when the firstborn died, every Egyptian deity who promised protection failed simultaneously. It was not that these gods were defeated in battle. It was that they were revealed never to have existed as anything more than human imagination given names and rituals. The plagues did not prove that Israel's God was stronger than Egypt's gods. They proved that Egypt's gods were not gods at all, that the entire elaborate religious system that had governed Egyptian life for thousands of years was built on illusion, that the priests and rituals and sacrifices and prayers had been offered to nothing, to emptiness dressed in mythology. But beyond the theological deconstruction of Egyptian, religion, the plagues revealed something profound about the nature of human will and divine sovereignty. Pharaoh hardened his heart. The text says this repeatedly. He chose defiance. He selected stubbornness. He decided again and again to resist God's commands and ignore the mounting evidence that he was wrong. But the text also says equally repeatedly that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. God strengthened Pharaoh's natural tendency toward pride, confirmed him in his chosen path of rebellion, gave him over to the consequences of his own decisions. This mysterious interplay between human choice and divine sovereignty, between Pharaoh's responsibility for his actions and God's purpose being accomplished through them, runs throughout the narrative. Pharaoh was not a puppet. He made real choices. He bears real guilt for the suffering he caused his own people through his stubborn refusal to yield. But at the same time, God was working through Pharaoh's hardness to accomplish a greater purpose, to multiply his wonders, to demonstrate his power so completely that no generation would ever forget what happened when Egypt enslaved his people. The question that haunted Egypt, that should haunt every reader of this story, is this: what did they never understand? What lesson remained unlearned even as the waters of the Red Sea closed over Pharaoh's army? They never understood that Israel was not just a labor force or a population to be controlled. Israel was God's firstborn son. The Lord had said this explicitly to Moses. Then say to Pharaoh, "This is what the Lord says. Israel is my firstborn son, and I told you, let my son go so he may worship me. But you refuse to let him go, so I will kill your firstborn son." It was a declaration of relationship and a warning of consequence. You harm my son, I will harm yours. You enslave my firstborn, I will take your firstborn. The judgment was not arbitrary. It was proportional. It was justice expressed through the very terms of the crime. Egypt had thrown Hebrew babies into the Nile. Egypt would watch its own firstborn die in a single night. Egypt had enslaved God's chosen people. Egypt would be enslaved to the consequences of that choice until its power was broken and its pride shattered. The lesson echoes across history, a warning that oppression always has a cost, that injustice never goes unanswered indefinitely, that those who harm the vulnerable and enslave the weak are storing up judgment for themselves. Egypt thought it could exploit Hebrew labor without consequence because the Hebrews were powerless. But they were not without a defender. They were not abandoned. They cried out, and their cries shattered heaven itself, and God came down to balance the scales. And yet, threaded through all the judgment, there was mercy. The plagues could have been worse. God could have simply killed all Egyptians in the first plague. But instead, he gave warning after warning, opportunity after opportunity for Pharaoh to choose differently. He sent Moses to announce each plague before it came, giving Egypt time to prepare, to protect themselves, to change course. Even in the final plague, God provided a way of escape through the Passover lamb, a way that was theoretically available to Egyptians as well if they had chosen to trust Israel's God and apply blood to their doorposts. The story of the plagues is ultimately the story of the Lamb, a perfect, unblemished sacrifice. Blood applied to doorposts marking the difference between death and life. Judgment passing over those protected by the blood while striking those without it. It was a picture so clear, so powerful, so central to God's plan of salvation that it would echo through all of Scripture until it found its fulfillment in another Passover, another lamb, another moment when blood would mark the boundary between judgment and mercy. When John the Baptist saw Jesus approaching, he declared, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." The connection was not subtle. Jesus celebrated Passover with his disciples, explained that the bread was his body broken and the wine his blood of the new covenant, then went to the cross at the exact time the Passover lambs were being slaughtered in the temple. The Apostle Paul wrote explicitly, Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. The pattern established in Egypt found its ultimate expression in Jerusalem: salvation through the blood of a lamb, protection from judgment through sacrifice, life emerging from death. The 10 plagues reveal that God takes sin seriously, that oppression has consequences, that pride will be broken, that false gods will be exposed, that justice will be done. But they also reveal that God provides a way of escape, that he warns before he judges, that he offers protection through sacrifice, that his anger is not his final word. The same night that brought death to Egypt brought deliverance to Israel. The same God who hardened Pharaoh's heart also softened the Israelites' hearts to trust and obey. The same power that destroyed an army in the sea also divided that sea to create a path of salvation. Egypt never understood that enslaving God's people was enslaving God's purpose, that oppressing those under divine covenant was opposing divinity itself, that 400 years of injustice would not go unanswered simply because the victims seemed powerless. The lesson remains relevant in every age. Those who harm the vulnerable, who exploit the weak, who profit from oppression are not operating in a moral vacuum. Justice may be delayed, but it is not canceled. God sees, God hears, God acts. And when he moves to deliver his people and judge their oppressors, all the power of empires cannot stand against him. As you settle into sleep tonight, let this ancient story wash over you like the waters of the Red Sea, carrying away the anxieties of the day, the fears of tomorrow. Rest in the knowledge that the same God who heard the cries of Hebrew slaves still hears the cries of the oppressed, still sees injustice, still moves to deliver and defend. Rest knowing that salvation and judgment are not opposite forces but two expressions of the same divine character. God making all things right, protecting his own, defeating his enemies, accomplishing his purposes through human history while respecting human choice. The plagues are over. Egypt is defeated. Israel is free. The lamb has been sacrificed. The blood has been applied. The sea has been crossed. And on the far shore the people of God stand singing, celebrating deliverance they did not earn and could not accomplish, recipients of grace expressed through judgment, witnesses to power beyond human comprehension, participants in a story that would echo through millennia as testimony to what God can do when he decides to liberate his people. Sleep now in the peace of knowing that this same God, who split seas and toppled empires and freed slaves and fulfilled every promise, is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The story of the 10 plagues is your story too. The tale of humanity trapped in bondage to sin and death, crying out for deliverance, protected by the blood of a lamb, passing through waters from death to life, singing songs of salvation on the far shore of judgment. Close your eyes. Let the waters settle. Rest in the arms of the God who fights for his people, who keeps his promises, who turns oppression into liberation, who makes a way where there is no way, who brings life from death, light from darkness, freedom from slavery, and rest from struggle. The plagues have taught their lesson. The story has revealed its truth. And you, listener, are invited to find yourself in this ancient narrative, protected by the same blood, delivered by the same power, loved by the same God who heard the cries of Hebrew mothers and answered with wonders that shook the world. Sleep well, knowing the battle belongs to the Lord and he has already won.